Hey guys, it's Danny. Welcome to another episode from our Orchid Care for Beginners series. Today I have a very good subject for you. We're going to talk about weaknesses or soft spots of some particular orchids, just so you know what to really try to avoid with these orchids. Now, generally, orchids as a family of plants do share multiple traits that can be considered weaknesses. But because we have so many very different orchids, each of them has their own little quirks. So I want to focus on these specific things today. I'm gonna take all of the most popular orchids and tell you what I find to be their worst weaknesses and what I think you should definitely try to avoid. Today's video, together with our entire Orchid Care for Beginners series, is of course sponsored by rePotme.com, who offers you everything you could possibly need to grow your orchid healthy. From their famous potting mixes to pots, fertilizers, accessories, they do have pretty much everything you need. But if you're into other types of houseplants, they do have something for you as well, as they're starting to really expand on the houseplant side of things as well. So I'll link you to their website down below in the description, together with some of the products that I have been using for years and I still use, I really like. Feel free to check them out at any time. And with that said, I think it's time to start. Let's start with the famous Phalaenopsis orchids. Most of us have Phalaenopsis, right? Alright, Phalaenopsis orchids. In my opinion and experience, the worst ailments are those that have to do with the crown or with the stem, so crown rot and stem rot. These are things that Phalaenopsis might actually not get rid of, at least not all that easy. Crown rot and stem rot, as the name suggests, is a decaying and ailment of a crown of a Phalaenopsis and the stem. These are the core, let's say, structures of a Phalaenopsis. Without them, roots cannot be created, leaves cannot sprout, let alone flowers. So if the central axis of a Phalaenopsis goes, the Phalaenopsis goes as well, entirely. Even if sometimes you can still have some lingering green roots on that axis, if there's nothing alive in that axis, the whole orchid is gone. Crown rot and stem rot are caused due to standing water in the crown of the orchid and in between the leaves in the middle axis area. Due to how we grow these orchids in cultivation and the actual conditions we have in our homes, living rooms, whatever, crown rot and stem rot are pretty prevalent in cultivation, and particularly maybe much more so than in nature. First off, we tend to grow our orchids upright, trying as much as possible to have an upright stem and leaves on the sides. Well, that is not a natural type of growth for a Phalaenopsis. Naturally, since they would be attached to trees or branches, they would grow something like this. The leaves almost on a vertical plane, not really on the sides, the stem pointing downwards, and you can imagine in this position all of the water that might accumulate in these structures can easily just fall off the leaves and structures. So that is one difference that favorizes pooling of water in the structures in cultivation. And the main other reasons just have to do with the actual environment in our living room. We don't have wind and fresh air all the time, perhaps. That little breeze that again favorizes evaporation. It also has to do with the bacterial and pathogen climate in our areas. Different areas will be more prone to different pathogens. It can also have to do with the type of water we're using. Rainwater is very poor in salts. However, tap water might not be, and that might affect the cuticle and pretty much the epidermis of the leaves. And there may very well be other reasons that just have to do with how we grow these orchids and how the environment is, in contrast with a natural environment. The best solution to this is prevention. I do talk a lot in my older videos about how you should not just sprinkle water on the orchid. Avoid pooling of water in the crowns, and if you have it, just remove it and things of the sorts. Because obviously, if we don't have standing pooling water in these structures, we don't have rot either, right? As for treatments, well, that's a little bit more tricky, and I will make sure to make an updated video on treating crown rot, because I do have a crown rotted Phalaenopsis at the moment. I just purchased it for the video, but I'll link it down below to how I like to go about things. This is for crown rot. When it comes to stem rot, I personally don't have a very elegant and efficient way of eliminating it, because crown rot, at least you know where it is. It starts from the crown. You can treat the crown. Stem rot, where does it start? Further down, further up, depends where that pool of water was, in between what leaves. It doesn't have an arrow pointing, it's here. So treating an entire stem for something is much, much harder without more toxic means like fungicides, let's say. In any case, what you should get from this video is that you should at all costs try to avoid standing water on the leaves and crowns. Some people might not have these issues depending on their environment. Many people actually do. The most asked question on my channel is, my orchid has lost all of its leaves. What can I do about it? Well, in this case, I don't think there is anything you can do about it. If all of the leaves on an orchid have fallen, it means the stem is seriously affected, the central axis. And in this case, I personally don't have a good advice for you. I don't want to give you false hope. Best to just avoid it. But definitely, in my experience, crown rot and stem rot are the biggest ailments of Phalaenopsis, even bigger than root rot. Root rot is easy, it's nothing. It's so common and easily fixable that it's really nothing. These other two, oh boy, they're the stuff of nightmares. All right, moving on to Cattleya Orchids. Beautiful, strong plants once again, but they do have soft spots. And in my opinion, the biggest weakness of a Cattleya is its roots. Cattleyas are notorious for losing roots and going into transplant shock, particularly after repotting. But they can also do so if the potting mix starts to break down and becomes acidic, or if it's too mushy and suffocating all of a sudden. Cattleya roots are, in my opinion, extremely sensitive. So what's important with a Cattleya is to repot at the right time, particularly with the species. Some of the species have particular seasons where they root out. Let's say a Cattleya only produces new roots in the spring. Well, if it's summer, autumn, or winter, no matter what you do, that Cattleya will not produce roots. So if you lose the mass of roots due to a repot, you're gonna have to wait until spring for that Cattleya to produce new roots. And in that time, your Cattleya can seriously dehydrate, if not even just die off, which happened to me quite a few times with species. With hybrids, things are not all that drastic, but still, even hybrids I find to be rather sensitive when it comes to their roots. So the best thing to do with Cattleyas is to repot them when you see brand new roots just starting to form. Tiny little tips that are not way too long. They could be just tiny little nubbins. That's when you should repot, because even if you lose the massive roots, you will have brand new roots just ready to take over the pot. So the amount of time in which the orchid will start to dehydrate will not be 9 months. It will be just a month or a month and a half. And that is very important. So as far as I'm concerned, the biggest con of Cattleyas is their roots. Other than that, they're just so incredibly tough. They last so well through high temperatures and drought. But when it comes to roots, I guess everybody has their own weaknesses, right? Next up, Oncidiums, their hybrids, and pretty much related other orchids, such as Brassias, Odontoglossums, all of that fun gathering. Well, these guys I find share quite the similarity with Phalaenopsis in the sense that they are prone to rotting, but in their case, it's about the new growth rotting. When new growth on Oncidium starts, it doesn't have a pseudobulb. It's just a leafy formation that has layers, just like an onion. If water gets trapped in those layers, the new growth can completely rot off. And since new growths are the future of the orchid, just like in the case of the Phalaenopsis, the newer leaves gave new space and new length to the Phalaenopsis. Well, for Oncidiums, it is their new growth. If we lose the new growth, everything will be stalled, because the only way this orchid can develop and grow is to create another new growth. So it is in our best interest not to sprinkle water and leave water just stand in this new growth. Again, just like with the Phalaenopsis. Because treating new growth rot is really not that easy. The new growth can sometimes be very, very tiny. You don't have enough space to eliminate all of that affected tissue, and in most cases than not, you will not be successful at it, no matter what type of solutions you use, even if you use strong fungicides. If the growth is too small to be salvageable, no amount of medicine, whatever treatments you want, can help it. So the best thing to do is to avoid it altogether. And this type of ailment yet again happens due to the condition we have in cultivation. We don't have a breeze constantly blowing through our living room. Nurseries have those big fans. People with greenhouses usually have a lot of ventilation, but in your living room, do you want to live in the breeze all the time? I guess not. So especially for those of us who have our orchids in our living rooms, in our bedrooms and things of the sorts where we don't have fans running all the time, it is especially important to just not take the risk and make sure we don't leave water standing in all of these growing structures. Next up, dendrobiums. Now, there are quite a few types of dendrobiums on the market. I will overly simplify this, even though it's not very correct, but it's a beginner video. There are two types of dendrobiums you can easily find: deciduous, not deciduous. The not deciduous dendrobiums include the Baryota, which I have here, beautiful orchid, also the Dendrobium Phalaenopsis types. And the deciduous dendrobiums include the Dendrobium nobilis, which are very, very popular in flower shops, but also other types of dendrobiums. The Dendrobium nobili actually is a semi-deciduous one. It will lose all of its leaves, not in its first year, but starting with the second year. For the non-deciduous dendrobiums, such as the Baryota and the Phalaenopsis types, I find that their biggest con is the fact that they attract pests like nothing else. If you have a pest in your grow room and you have Phalaenopsis, Vandas, Cattleyas, Oncidiums, they will go to the dendrobiums. Not entirely sure why, because I cannot say dendrobiums have very sensitive leaves, but pests probably really like the taste. Both the Baryota and the Dendrobium Phalaenopsis types are super strong plants. I would recommend them to any beginner, and I do have a tutorial on dendrobiums. Check it down below in the description. They're some of the greatest orchids you can have, maybe even a little better than Phalaenopsis because they don't have that crown rot and stem rot issue. They don't have the root issue. They can adapt to various types of temperatures. I cannot stress how easy to grow these guys are. But when it comes to pests, it's a nightmare. I don't know what it is that attracts pests so much to the leaves of these orchids. But the biggest thing you need to take care of is that you don't have pests in your grow room or on your other plants, because trust me, they will find their way to the orchid and they will colonize it. There is a little bit of a silver lining though. Even though they might affect all of the leaves, the dendrobium will be absolutely fine, most probably, because it is a sympodial orchid. It doesn't have a central axis, it has pseudobulbs. So as long as it keeps creating new growth, the orchid will be absolutely fine. Maybe slightly set back, but knowing how strong these dendrobiums are, maybe not even very set back. So if you do have a pest infestation that decimated the entire leafage of the orchid, don't worry all that much. Wait for the new growth. There is a lot of energy stored in these canes that I do believe most of the times will feed the new growth. Just get rid of the pests. Now that you don't have leaves, it will be much easier to get rid of the pests because these guys don't really like the pseudobulbs. They only want the leaves. But just treat the pseudobulbs as well. Consider it a fresh start. So even if they are pest magnets, most of the times it's easy to get rid of them. Now, when it comes to the deciduous dendrobiums, and I will focus a lot on the nobili because I find it the worst, one of the issues you will encounter with them is seasoning, let's say, and not the type you put in your salad. No, it's making them grow according to seasons. Nobilis really have a very specific type of growth. They grow in the warmer months, spring and summer, then in the autumn they stop growing. Their new growths are mature, and they start to go into that little bit of rest they do during winter. They will not necessitate all that much watering, no fertilizer. Then in the winter, the older pseudobulbs start losing some of their leaves, and then in spring they bloom, and together with blooms, new growth starts, and the cycle repeats. Well, if your environment is not spot on, spring, summer, autumn, winter, then you're gonna have issues with your nobili. And that's what happened to me over the past few years. My environment is mainly warm, very, very short winter, not all that cold anyway. In a matter of a few years, I depleted the nobilis completely because they could not adapt to my seasoning. That is one of the major weaknesses of Dendrobium nobilis. When it came to arranging their growth according to season, I completely failed in my subtropical environment. I can imagine in tropical environments, the story can be a little worse. I personally stopped growing nobilis due to the environment, So be warned, for a few years they might try to grow, they might bloom as well, but that doesn't mean anything. If they're not seasoned, they will just deplete themselves. They depend on that season to know what they have to do. Next up, slipper orchids, Paphiopedilum orchids. These guys are again wonderful for beginners. They don't require a lot of work. They're very similar to Phalaenopsis, but they're not epiphytes, they're terrestrial. They do actually share a weakness, and this is crown rot. Now, Paphiopedilums are sympodials. They're not monopodials. They don't have a central stem that always continuously grows at the top. No, actually each fan is more like a pseudobulb. They do have rhizomes, and this is how they grow. But you can see the fan does have that funnel shape that Phalaenopsis orchids have as well. I would say that crown rot is not all that abundant with slippers. They're a little bit more adapted, but it can still happen. And especially if you trap water in the new growth in the crown when it's not very warm outside, when maybe you have lower temperatures in your growing room, when maybe the humidity is a little higher. And recently it happened to me as well. Yeah, after 9 years of growing these guys, I crown rotted most of my Paphiopedilums. Why? Because the stars aligned, because that's how my environment made them react. I'm not growing them in their natural habitat, I'm growing them in an artificial room. Things happen. So again, with these guys, I would definitely try to avoid water in the new growth and in the existing fans. There are 2 things that can happen here. 1, lose the new growth, which is very important for the growth of the slipper. 2, lose the entire plant if you leave the water standing in one of the main crowns, in one of the main growths. Treating it again, it's a bit of a hassle and definitely a gamble if nothing else. So I would much rather avoid it. Try to maintain the crowns dry as possible. And the second little weakness of these guys is the roots. The roots, oh, they're not very flexible. They're also very hairy naturally. So when you try to remove that potting mix, if you have bark, if you have big pieces of bark, it's just going to rip off that velamen and the roots will not like it. I don't find these guys to be as sensitive as Cattleyas, but they are much more sensitive than Phalaenopsis, that is for sure. So I would definitely pre-soak any slipper orchid before on-potting it. I would not work with dry media with these guys. The roots can also be very brittle if they're not wet and flexible. So it happens that they just snap and break from the mildest of action. So be careful with their roots. It's not incredibly bad, but it is a weakness they have that other orchids just don't. Alrighty then, Vandas. Vandas are tough cookies. Let me tell you, I thought about it a lot because I don't think they have many weaknesses, to be fully honest. So I came up with 2, but these 2 have some conditions to be met. 1, I would say that one of their weaknesses is their roots. But this doesn't necessarily have to do with the orchid, but how they are offered to us for sale. Most Vandas are bare-rooted. And in case you want to keep your Vanda potted, which is absolutely doable, you can definitely do it, you would have to go through the transition of adjusting the roots to potting mixes. And that can end in disaster because these roots, being adjusted to only air, will most likely go into transplant shock and not survive. So you would have to wait for new roots to get adjusted to a potting medium. At least this is the thing that I personally deal with the most. If you don't want to pot your Vanda, you will not have to deal with this. You can keep it bare-rooted. If you have the time to water, that's absolutely fine. So you can see, this is why I was saying it has to meet some conditions to be a weakness. And second, I would go with light. Vanda orchids are pretty high light plants, and some of them will simply not bloom if you don't offer a lot of light. As you can see, we're not talking here about things that can destroy the orchid, but things that can make it not bloom. Because honestly, you guys, I thought about it, and even though, yes, there are instances where you can crown rot a Vanda or stem rot a Vanda, honestly, it doesn't really happen all that much. Yes, it will happen. I know some of you had it happen. I personally don't know if I ever had it happen. So statistically speaking, it's not necessarily such a huge deal. I find that other random ailments play a more major role, such as sunburns, which can happen if you leave any orchid in the sun, or maybe Fusarium, or a fungal or bacterial infection, just random illnesses that can determine either root rot or maybe stem rot, but not to the same degree as Phalaenopsis. So, should we draw the conclusion that Vandas are the most robust orchids you can have? I don't know. What do you guys think? And lastly, jewel orchids, which are becoming more and more popular across the world in flower shops or garden centers, which is so nice. I'm gonna be sure to make a full beginner tutorial on these plants very, very soon. Don't worry. But since more and more people have these guys, let me just tell you what I think are the weaknesses of these orchids. First off, light. These orchids do not like a lot of light. I have the best success with my jewel orchids, be them Nicosia or Macotis, in very shady conditions, even a little less than Phalaenopsis can handle. Some symptoms of too much light can include bleaching of the leaves, so yellowing of the leaves to an extent. You want to have a nice green coloration on those leaves. If they're too washed out, maybe you are offering a little bit too much light. Artificial light is great for these orchids, natural light is great, but keep them shaded because I think they will look much, much better. And second, fertilizer, but not over-fertilization. Under-fertilization. I find these plants are pretty heavy feeders. First of all, they're terrestrial, so definitely they are used to much more nutrients than epiphytic orchids, which just grab whatever they can from that tree trunk. They don't have a whole lot of, let's call it mulch and other things just breaking down, offering nutrients at the soil level. These guys do. And I find that, again, in my experience, if you don't fertilize these plants properly, if you try to grow them as epiphytes, they're just not gonna look all that well. And I do have some examples to show you, again, with discolorations on the leaves. These are not caused by too much light, they're caused by deficiencies. And I have corrected them ever since. The newer leaves look absolutely great, but I made sure to offer proper fertilizer. I would treat these guys as normal houseplants, nothing to do with how we grow epiphytic orchids. I find this is the best way to grow them, but I will talk more about it in that future video. For now though, just keep in mind these two things. Too much light is not good, and too little fertilizer, again, is not good. And that is about it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Of course, there are other ailments that can affect these orchids. I try to focus on like the biggest ones, and definitely the ones that I confronted myself with a lot. But let me know in the comments section, is there something that you always have happening with particular orchids? What do you think causes it? Could it be your environment or something that you're using that triggers it? Let us know down below in the comments section. And with that said, thank you so much for watching. Thank you rePotme for sponsoring yet another Orchid Care for Beginners series. If you want to follow me, you can search for me. I'm at MissOrchidGirl pretty much everywhere. But most importantly, do subscribe to this channel for regular orchid and plant content on a weekly basis. And with that said, hope you have a great day. I'll see you next time. Bye.